welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you. Great to be here.
It's great to be here in the middle of, we're not in the middle of Iowa, but we're in the middle of winter. You are an expert on Thomas Bewick, so maybe you could start by telling us who he was.
Thomas Bewick was born in 1753, something I can relate to because I was born in 1953. And he was born in Northumberland, and I was born in Northumberland. Northumberland is a county in the northeast of England, and it's very important. I think it's part of my heritage. Now I look back at my later years to how I come to be doing what I'm doing. Thomas Bewick was a young lad growing up in the late 18th century there, outside of Newcastle, about 16 miles from Newcastle, which was a big industrial centre then. Coal mining was beginning to be popular. In fact, his father had a little colliery there too. And he had an ability for drawing, which led him to an apprenticeship with an engraver in Newcastle, Beilby and Son, and he learned about engraving. And there's, of course, engraving on metal, and silvers, copper, and all these things. And he had a knack also for engraving on wood, but the shop didn't like to do the engraving on wood, so Thomas would get the jobs, the wood engraving jobs.
Why would there be a wood engraving job versus a copper engraving job?
Because at that time, late 18th century, wood engraving was becoming popular as a means of book illustration, but it was still fairly crude, and the first engravings which Bewick did were very rudimentary. They were the mathematical drawings. It was Charles Hutton's mensuration that he was illustrating, so these are mathematical diagrams. They're quite exquisite. But in his spare time, he became interested in natural history, which led him to publish the first of 2 volumes, very important volumes in natural history, A History of Quadrupeds, which he wrote and illustrated, with engravings of animals, which at the first time actually looked like real animals. They were incredibly detailed.
This is an early edition?
This is the early edition of the Quadrupeds. It's missing its title page, but this was published in 1797. Second edition, I think, 1804 or thereabouts.
Wood engravings, then, why were they becoming popular in books?
Well, just behind you on the table there's some boxwood blocks that the wood engravings would have been done on.
Right.
And they were cut to the same height as type, the metal type, which meant they could be printed together at the same time on the same presses as the letterpress.
So they could be adjusted to being the same height as the type.
They were cut to 0.918 of an inch to type height,
as opposed to the other mediums, which would be.
Well, prior to that, the other medium was, of course, it was copper plate,
right?
Steel engravings or etchings, which had to be printed on a completely different press. So this was revolutionizing book illustration.
And they had to be printed on a completely different press because...
The steel engravings?
Yeah.
Yes, because it's a totally different method of printing. It's intaglio rather than relief printing. What
would you say this is akin to, this kind of revolutionary...
Photography, the digital world, desktop type publishing. And it is exactly the same in some ways, because you could print illustrations with a book far more economically than you could before. And these little humble blocks of wood were far more durable. And Thomas Bewick was called upon, when it was found he had a propensity for doing this, to do more and more and more. Then eventually, when he finished his apprenticeship, he set up his own workshop. And they did a huge number of engravings for the newspapers, the newspaper advertisements and book illustrations. And Bewick was asked the question once, how many times do you think this block's been printed from? And so he asked his printer, and he did the figures, and 900,000 impressions have been taken from one of these little blocks of wood.
Now, there must be a special kind of wood to be that durable.
Traditionally, it's boxwood, and it's cut across the grain, like you would slice a cucumber, as opposed to the plank grain, which is what you would use if you were to do a woodcut. And so it's very fine. Boxwood.
What kind of wood is that? Is that like, I think of birch? Is it connected?
It's like a shrubbery tree. Maple is also very, very hard and durable, and contemporary engravers do use maple. It's a slow-growing tree, so it's very close-grained. pear is another word. Lemon wood, fruit trees can be used as well.
So dense and...
Very close grained. There's no, you can't see the...
It's almost like a slab of marble.
The Buxus sempervivens, I think, is the Latin name for it.
And so that really is the best wood then?
Yeah. And of course, what you have there behind you is the typical log. That diameter is, that's quite a large one. But if you imagine that as in a complete round, it's not very big.
No, it's maybe 5 inches across.
And if you look at most of Bewick's engravings, apart from the fact that they're designed to fit this 3 or 4 inch measure, whatever that is, the blocks are just the right size.
Yeah, the actual tree itself is taken into account with the work.
It's perfectly suited for this kind of work. Of course, as time goes on, and remember Bewick was pioneering. He was a pioneer at the stage in that he was the first person really to do such engravings that looked like this, that looked real. I mean, some of the animals are a little unusual, and he hadn't seen them, of course, and he would rely upon travelling. There's the camellia part, you see, it's a cross between a giraffe and a leopard. It's called the camelopard, camelliapard.
Or a camel too, right?
Yes.
They're exquisite though, aren't they?
But you look as well that not only was he engraving the figures of the animals, but the backgrounds are little rural scenes, little vignettes drawn from the landscape in which he lived.
So he would put all these exotic animals in familiar terrain.
And if we look at some of the more domestic animals, you'd find little scenes from Northumberland, which in many cases I think would reflect the cottage, actual Bewick's own birthplace and so on, and buildings and the fields around him.
And you can actually visit this place. Is the cottage still there?
You can visit his birthplace, and now in the National Trust have it. That's a be a good place for your literary tourists to go.
This book came out, did he simply illustrate it and someone else wrote it?
No, he wrote it as well. History of Quadrupeds was first, and then he went on to do 2 volumes of British birds.
And this was a big success right off the bat?
Huge success, yeah. I mean, the number of editions it went through.
So this made him.
He became famous. Audubon went to see him. He's up there. He was one of the...
And it just sort of came to him. It was a love of his, and it connected with his talent. Did he self-publish?
Yes, he did. He was publishing in Newcastle with the booksellers.
Okay, so would they get together and finance the printing then? What are we looking at here?
We're jumping ahead a little bit, but when I went to art school, I learned about wood engraving. I didn't know who Thomas Bewick was, strangely enough, having come from the northeast. But I found out very quickly that I came from the same county as Thomas Bewick. In fact, my very first wood engraving was a rather awful copy of a wood engraving by Thomas Bewick, a fox. When I finished my art school, my art college time, I went back to Newcastle and, to cut a long story short, discovered that the central library, the public library in Newcastle, was a collection of Bewick's original woodblocks. And my interest was such that it coincided with a bicentenary, a quinquencentenary, 150 years since Bewick's death in 1828. In 1978, I published a collection of his woodblocks and printed from his original blocks.
That's pretty neat. And these blocks are still crisp and
they still, remember, they can be printed from to over and above 900,000 times if they're printed carefully. And of course, the printing of them is another story altogether. You have to remember when these first books of his were printed, they were printed on wooden common presses, on dampened paper, and there were ink dabbers. They didn't have ink rollers in those days.
It wasn't an iron press then, it was a wooden press. No, this is
pre-iron presses. And Bewick was rather disgruntled with the way that some of the impressions came out. And if you look at them, they're not consistent and they're not the best they can be. And so it was my aim to print at least impressions that Bewick would be happy with. And printing them individually, or maybe 2 at a time, carefully. And although I printed mine on an iron hand press, recreating the dampened paper and the soft blanket that was necessary, because he found that the fine lines in his engravings weren't holding the ink because the dampened paper had a soft blanket behind it and it was pushing the ink off the lines. So what does he do? He lowers the surface of the wood blocks and then engraves it so it receives less pressure. And then he discovers that he's actually controlling the tone of these things. And if you grade that lowering, you can get an engraving to print from dark to light.
From left to right.
Left to right, or
whatever. Yeah.
Whatever. And especially with the engravings of the birds, which were later than came after the animals, the quadrupeds that he did, when he's in his prime.
So
He's using this to great effect. You see the tonality going across the breasts of the bird, and you can see the impression there where he's lowered it on the reverse of the... Right. That's the block itself wasn't flat. It's like a sculpture.
So you were using... It was not new technology, but better technology than he had access to.
I had the privilege of more time. I wasn't concerned with printing an edition of a book. I wasn't just a printer. I was an artist, if you like.
He didn't have access to what you had access to, obviously.
Well, eventually he did, because iron hand presses came in, and then iron cylinder presses came in. So the later engravings that he did aren't sculpted in the same way.
Yeah, because they didn't have to be.
No, and the presses they were printed on were again, they were different.
And so, what else did he spend his time doing? These were sort of his magnum opuses?
Well, to the contrary, these engravings of birds and animals were the work he did after the work of the day in the shop was done, after the day's work was done. So for the most part, a lot of them would have been done by candlelight, would you believe?
So was he working for someone else, or did he have his own company?
He was publishing them himself.
But the day work...
It was his business then. The Beilby work. Bewick and Beilby went into partnership with his former master and then set up on his own. And he had apprentices, which was the other interesting thing. So he was teaching people, Luke Clennell, who I also did, and his younger brother John, and many other people who went on to become engravers, moved to London and continued to do what he was doing. But it was not the business of the workshop to do these things. What they were doing in the workshop were engraving things like dog collars and silver bowls and coffin labels and coal certificates, share certificates, and also doing bookbinders' tools as well. Everything you can imagine that needed engraving, they did. And it's mostly metal engraving.
So just his own passion, kind of his own hobby.
It was a hobby in some respect, because it became more than a hobby as it grew. Right. And he became well known, and he had a great many friends, and people would send him specimens. I found a lot of information relating to how he compiled the books, where the stuffed birds that was sometimes sent to him, or the live birds, sometimes stinking, he records in his workshop notebooks there, and how there would be the list of expenditure in the account books would be bird seed. So he's obviously keeping these birds alive at the same time.
I think that's one of the concerns that's raised about Audubon, the number of birds that he killed.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's like live models.
That's right.
Recently live, anyway.
And there's certain, some of them, he writes about one arriving where it's as stiff as a poker. The specimen is so awful, it's dreadful. And some of the specimens still exist to this day that he used.
How do they do? Like they stuff them, I guess.
Yeah. Taxidermy was a big thing.
Yeah.
And of course, they were very popular.
Just if you could speak to the fact that you came from the same place that he came from, you're doing similar things to what he did. How does that manifest itself inside of you?
God knows. I'm thinking, trying to give you an eloquent answer to this, but the fact that he's from the same clan, the same tribe, if you like.
Right.
People from the Tyne side, the River Tyne runs through it.
Newcastle on Tyne.
Newcastle on Tyne. Bewick grew up on the banks of the Tyne. He would go across the Tyne on his way to school. He would swim in the icy waters. He would run around on the banks of the Tyne. I was born on Tyneside. I'm a Geordie, is what they call the people from Tyneside. We're from the same part of the country, although I was born near the coast and he was born in west of the town. I think, and I've said this before, that in Bewick's case, he had an artistic sensitivity to the landscape around him, and he had an eye for detail and an ability to draw in the way that John Constable did growing up in Suffolk and in what's now known as Constable country. Like any artist with a sensibility to his surroundings and a sense of place, cannot help but be inspired by nature, if you like, that's all around you.
And also, I guess, the fact that your people have been surrounded by that nature for hundreds of years.
I mean, if you live in looking at the landscape of Grasmere there, you cannot, and you're an artist, you cannot help but be inspired to paint and to draw these places. So I feel kindred spirit. And of course he was a wood engraver and I learnt wood engraving. I know what he's up to and I've copied Bewick's engravings, and believe me, let me tell you, there's not one wasted mark. And we're talking about tiny marks, tiny, minuscule marks. He was not only a superb craftsman, but an artist. And his watercolours, too, are wonderful. The Bewick scholar is Ian Bain, who has written a lot about Bewick and has a huge collection of Bewick material, correspondence, and everything you can imagine. And I've known him a long time, and he was a little sceptical, I think, of this young man who I was in my 20s even when I was doing my first Bewicks. What did I know about printing Bewick?
Sounds about right, yeah.
1978, 53, 25, yeah. 25-year-old with these wonderful, precious blocks. But he could see, I think, that my heart was in the right place, and we've become good friends. I've always said there's no one definitive way to print Bewick. There's many different ways to print them, and many different approaches, but I wanted to be respectful to the work he'd done. Ian Bain published a book about Thomas Bewick's watercolours, which I was asked to bind, curiously, in 2 volumes for a presentation to the Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, when he came to open a sewage works in Northumberland. Anyway, I inquired of the palace to find out what colour leather that they should be using for these 2 volumes of Bewick's watercolours. And the word came back, there was a colour which could only be described politely as nut brown. Now we know Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, has a sense of humour. What of this was his working out? I have no idea. But I duly bound those volumes, and the grain of one of the volumes was the grain of the paper was the wrong way. And grain is very, very important. Grain direction when you're making a book. If you get it the wrong way, the book doesn't open properly, and all the leaves stand up. And I remember Ian Bain saying to me, who designed these books? He said, the paper was specially made for the book. He said, the paper maker probably got some of his porridge mixed up in the pulp. It was a nice image.
If you wanted to, not necessarily become an expert, but if you wanted to connect with Bewick, you could actually go there, as you say, as a literary tourist. Now, where precisely do you go?
You would go to a place called Cherryburn, which is on the south bank of the town, about 15 miles west of Newcastle. And are the 2 cottages that Bewick was brought up in, lived in, and it's now owned by the National Trust, who preserves a lot of these historical buildings, and it's open to the public, and they've recreated the farmyard there that features in so many of his little engravings. And it's a charming place, and across the river is the town of Ovingdon, where he went to school, and you can see that's where he's buried there too. And you can see the slate floor where Bewick supposedly drew and did sketches. And I would say, if you want to know about Bewick, read his autobiography, his memoir. It has a lot of colour in it.
Great. Well, thanks so much for sharing the technical as well as the emotional connections that you have with Bewick, and invite listeners to get on over there.
Go and see it. It's a very popular place, and there's a Bewick Society now that you can join that keeps you up to date on the current events and so on.
Great. Thanks very much.
You're welcome.